Chris, hey, do you have a second for a coffee?
I do, but because today is a special afternoon Tinto edition of Morning Tinto, I have a green tea with me, so hopefully I'll be able to sleep tonight and not be too caffeinated to sleep. But yes,
I can't even drink green tea. It's like too much caffeine for me.
do you have water with you today?
I do have a water and yeah, it feels even though I know you didn't watch the President Trump's not State of the Union 6 week State of the Union last night. And I didn't either, but I did hear some reports from it. It feels a bit like morning after hangover, even though I didn't actually watch it. But there's so many people talking about it. It feels like, I guess what's up for me is last night when other people were watching it, I was listening to a podcast um, between, and it's the podcast is called Columbia Calling, and I'll put a link to it. And it's an Englishman, like a journalist, hotel owner who lives here in Colombia, and he interviews people. Um, and he interviewed like this Colombian journalist, and it was about like all the political stuff going on here with the president. And there's this one thing that's going on where the president, who's, leftist guy, first, it's like historically the first leftist president ever here. He like reshuffled his cabinet, which I guess he's done a lot, which isn't that big of a deal. But he brought on board this guy who has like sexual allegations against him and like just like a really like, why would you do that? And so all these women are upset and other people. And he's apparently this guy that's like been close to every president that there's ever been, even the right ones, the centrist, and they were, and it, and I had to listen, really carefully to this podcast, and then ask my partner about it as well to try to understand what's going on. And I guess it's like there's a political player, like he's this political player that can get things done, but he comes with all this disgusting baggage. And the thing is, the president, Petro, here, he's only got like just over a year left and he can't run again. They have one term limit. And so, because he doesn't, his party or whatever isn't in control of Congress, he can't do very much, of course. And so he's in this situation where he needs to get something done before he leaves, like especially healthcare reform. And please, please get healthcare reform done because I feel the effects of it all the time. What a mess it is here. And it's just so nasty. Like, what is going on? And I know this isn't special to Colombia. The UK, the US, all these countries have this kind of political system where I don't really think it's real democracy. Like, what is democracy? Isn't it that we get our voices heard? We get to participate in decision making. Remember when we talked about, I think it was in the We Are Lock podcast. So everyone else will have to go back. I think it's in that final episode we did with a guest recently where I talked about a podcast seriously wrong and like this information about utopias and and this billionaire had been frozen and then like come out of being a billionaire. Like that was like the joke. And so that he's like waking up and like it's utopia and he's like, but where's all my money? All that kind of stuff, right? But people were like eventually asking him questions like, what was it like, back then when there wasn't utopia? And one of the things people were like, were, well, how could people decide on things that affected their lives if they only like voted every 4 years? Like, I don't understand. Like, how does that work? It's like, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, does it? That's just what's on my mind. Like this Congress, and you've got political things going on, and yet who's benefiting from that? Like it feels like we're not benefiting from that. And where's the democracy in this? It's people are so affected, like we've talked about, on these episodes. People are so affected by what's going on around the world with people who've been elected.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, as you're speaking, I'm thinking back to things that I used to see, not only say 2015, 2016, but also even yesterday or the day before, people talking here in the United States of America about the campaign of Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie Sanders has come up a number of times in certain, let's just say, progressive YouTube channels with not only the things that he said in 2016, but also the well documented things that the Democratic Party, shall we say, establishment or apparatus did to his campaign in the 2016 campaign, where ultimately Hillary Clinton was selected to be the Democratic Party candidate. Bernie was or is, I believe, currently on, I don't know what he's calling it, but let's just say a Speak Out Against Oligarchy tour going around the country. And I'll see if I can find a link to at least one YouTube video I've seen, and we can place that in the show notes. This idea of what is democracy, what does it mean to represent the people, and particularly, what are the mechanisms that are in place to determine who actually goes onto ballots, right? Even put aside the fact that electoral politics, federal politics here in the United States is essentially a once every 2 to 4 year affair, depending on your congressional voting schedule. But even putting aside the lack of frequency, there's also the lack of choice. And I used to follow I believe it was the candidates from the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or the PSL here. The presidential candidates from that party here in the United States were Claudia de la Cruz, the presidential candidate, and vice president candidate Karina Garcia, I believe were their names. And I used to follow the emails that they sent on a regular basis about the machinations they had to go through just to get on the ballot on a state by state basis going across the country. And here in New York State, they did not get on the ballot. They basically said, if you want to vote for us, you must write our names in. And what I later learned is you not only had to write their names in, of course, spelling completely correctly, but you also had to match the capitalization and lowercase of every character in all of their names exactly, or your vote wouldn't count. So this is just one of many hurdles that must be overcome by candidates who wish to run, in this case, for president. And that's without talking about the money involved in making elections happen. And to be honest, just with total truth, I actually don't know what most of that money goes toward. Is it just advertising, marketing? But yeah, campaigns, travel, touring, paying staff. I mean, it's probably all of those, but campaigns, I think it was President Obama who ran the first billion-dollar campaign, and that's billion with a B. So does that is that what democracy looks like? May the richest person win, basically?
I remember just so much about campaign finance reform. You probably do as well over the years. It's I lived in the UK for 17 years and they call an election and then they have like 6 weeks to campaign. It's so nice. It's like what is going on in the US to have it be years of like this basically. But yeah, um the money, I don't know. I like thinking of, we've done this before, this like looking outside my window and like what what is all this mess going on, that just benefits so few people when, we need needs to be met. We need to be able to eat. Like what do we need to do to be able to ensure that everyone gets enough food? What are we doing to make sure that we get shelter, health care, um, a chance to do meaningful work? That has nothing to do with money. And to be able to look in your neighborhood and say, maybe, who would I trust in this neighborhood who would make some decisions on our behalf that would make sure that our water stays clean, that we have enough water, that there's food growing locally, like just to be like with some strangers on a ballot and you have so little control over who gets put on the ballot. That's not democracy. It's just not democracy.
In one of our episodes, it may have been our first episode under the Morning Tinto banner, I said something about every once in a while getting this imagery of the dinosaurs trotting on the earth 65 million years ago. And under their feet, in bushes or burrows or wherever, these tiny little creatures that were the descendants, or I should say, the ancestors of all of today's mammals, including us humans, these tiny little rat or shrew like creatures. And I'd made at the time the comment that in the face of massive forces, like presidential elections, like states fighting against each other, um, whatever you want to call it, economic warfare, neocolonialism, all the different terms that you and I are familiar with in terms of money being power at massive scales. In the face of all these massive forces, there's still us trying to work together, hopefully most of the time, to just get our needs met, sometimes at the most hyperlocal of scales. I come from a place where I used to be all about large scale thinking, large scale change. I was trained as an environmental policy analyst. I first, out of graduate school, worked as a consultant to the Department of Energy and worked on a number of regulations for energy efficiency, light bulbs and battery chargers. Those were two of the domains that I was working in. And these were both national standards. And part of the analysis was, what is the life cycle cost of this product and how much money will consumers actually save if we were to put in these standards? And the time horizon we were looking at, this was back in 2008, 2009, was how much money will be saved between now and the year 2042. And that was part of the cost benefit analysis we had to do to justify this standard. Well, then I went to work for the Federal Aviation Administration. And part of the function that I had was to participate in international rulemaking and standard setting through a body of the United Nations called the International Civil Aviation Organization, or ICAO. And it was the same thing. If we put in these standards, hypothetically, maybe air emissions will reduce 6% by the year 2050. How much would it cost? And then negotiating with all the manufacturers and all the states, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a time in my life when I was always about big scale stuff, always thinking about the scale. But at the same time, there were the seeds of my own disillusionment in that process. Like I said, 5-6% reduction by the year 2050. Is this really going to change people's lives? I wouldn't say now that I've gone over to the opposite side, but certainly I've become much more drawn to questions of what can I do as a person connected to the people nearest to me? What do they need now? And how can I support them as simply and quickly as possible? And these are the things that I think about oftentimes when I talk to you, not just today, because you often bring and represent that perspective of very simply meeting each other's needs. These are words that you've said many times. I'm actually interested to hear if you have any examples in mind of what this type of hyperlocal support looks like. What does it look like as an example to meet each other's needs? And you've been in many types of circles over the past 17, 18, 19, 20 years and beyond. And you've talked about what does it mean to you to be a communitarian anarchist? And you've talked about different writings from people like Peter Gelderloos, who also discusses these things, not just in terms of theory, but in terms of what people have actually done in the past and also now, and what people are doing in different communities around the world to meet each other's needs. I'm wondering what comes to you in times like these. What examples come to mind, either in your own life or the lives of others that you've seen? So I think I'd really like for our listeners to hear that the stuff we talk about, it's not just made up. It's based on real things that people have done with success.
Yeah, I mean, um, when I founded an organization for refugees and asylum seekers in England, that was me noticing a need. That was me noticing that on one level, I was watching the news and seeing what I call the racism crisis, but was called the refugee crisis, of all these migrants coming into Europe, mainly due to Syria, but it was a mixed group of people, and feeling helpless. And so my need was to contribute in some way. And I wanted to get that need met. And I could see there was a lot of need, in people who were crossing over. So one thing related to that was going to what was called the jungle in Calais, France, where there was a camp of migrants living there and waiting to get somehow over to England, waiting to get on boats or trucks or whatever. And I went to that camp and saw everyone trying to meet each other's needs. Like they had built up like a little town out of tents, and some Afghanis had set up a restaurant. Like these are migrants, who are doing that. And people like me, like the do-gooders from from outside France would come and help, like bring things, bring tents, bring clothes. There were places set up where people could go to say what they needed, and then people would try to find a way to meet the needs. That's a real basic, like example of like people really needing, to survive in those conditions with police repression, intimidation happening. Um, of course, just like in any society, there's crime, there's, women having to be safe. So, all of that, like how can we create a space for women who've traveled alone to have a place where they can sleep? All of that was going on. It was really amazing space. And they had a library, they were teaching, they had different places of worship. And of course, it got destroyed because this is an example that threatens capitalism. It threatens, like you're not supposed to get your needs met by one another in this way. But I went back to England, more determined, to do something. And that's why I founded the organization. And I saw that there were people like me in our county in Lincolnshire who wanted to do something. We wanted to help people, but our county wasn't a dispersal area for asylum seekers, for resettlement of Syrians or anything. So I created the organization so that we could partner with organizations in larger cities who did have asylum seekers and resettled Syrians, that they could come have like holidays with us, like have breaks, get out of the city and come to a rural area and stay with families. So that's meeting people's needs, like both the needs for us to want to contribute in some way to a crisis and for them to feel welcome into England, to get to know English culture if they didn't already, practice their English with families, go to the beach, all of that. Then the next example would be COVID, because I don't know what it was like in the US, but I was in um, Sunderland in the UK when it hit. And well, immediately the government did put into place an app where you could volunteer. But the point being, it was like people needing to get medication or needing groceries and couldn't leave the house because they're vulnerable. And so you would volunteer to go do that. And so there was a lot of trust involved because it happened so quickly. COVID just like hit, and it's not like everyone could be vetted, which normally the UK would do. You have to go through like a police, like you submit something to the police for them to say, yeah, this person doesn't have any prior criminal record. She can be a volunteer for whatever thing, or volunteer with children, like all of that. It's all pretty tightly controlled. And this was a lot more like, okay, we need people. We're not going to have time to do that. And so to, go to pick up someone's prescription and take it to their house and have a little conversation with them at the door. That's like meeting needs, getting their groceries, them saying like what groceries they wanted, felt like a very vulnerable thing to tell someone what groceries you want, because people can judge you, like on your junk food and everything. It's like we are going through a really stressful moment in history with a pandemic, and maybe we want to eat junk food, like who cares? So there's that. There's things happening in the US right now around how to provide abortions safely, especially when people can't leave the state, cross the state line, because the police will question you if you're a young woman traveling across the state line. It's just really scary. And trans folks working out where's the safest place to go, people in Europe saying, well, it's getting worse here. I'm not sure where people should go to be safe. So thinking about people's real immediate needs for safety, for safe health care, for shelter. I know there's people who go to the border of Mexico and provide water and food to migrants. Um, you know, so we're talking like some extreme cases of like life or death, water, food, and then other things related to, being able to help our neighborhoods, like, churches where someone's ill and people take turns making food for that person. That's something that churches can do really well. And the far right is using churches as a place to provide mutual aid. And it's working, that it brings people in and it connects people, creates community. And the left doesn't really have that kind of easy pathway in to doing things. And that kind of takes us into, back to when we were speaking about left right politics. That comes up in just like basic supporting each other. The left, they do these things around mutual aid, trans support, abortion care, helping migrants. They're doing all of that. I think what's difficult is how someone would find their way into that work if they're not already well connected, because there isn't this rigid ideology that might pull people in through a church or, like one location where you're going to get people who think kind of along the same lines. And the left is a bit more diverse and complex in that way. So I don't think we should go for rigid radicalism, but I think people do naturally want to be of service and help others. And so going local in this way is really healthy in what it means to be human. And sometimes we're so disconnected and we don't know where to even begin.
Yeah, thank you for sharing this. And I think everything that you said illustrates not only things that have been done, things that you yourself have led, but also the diversity of ways in which we as people can meet the needs of other people and also try to ask for our needs to be met. There are a few groups up here, and I'm in New York City, a few groups that I've observed, and I will say straight out, I have not participated very much in these groups. I've mostly been observing their chats. But as an example, there is a very local group of an organization called Indivisible that I've been following. And people there have talked about their actions going to protests, calling elected officials, meeting to support immigrants, showing messages of welcome and invitation to people. I'm in a group for a chapter of the organization called Heal Palestine, which we'll list in the show notes. And last year, there were many messages of people organizing to support somebody who was severely injured in a bombing in Gaza um, done by the state of Israel. She was evacuated, and probably evacuated is maybe not the accurate word, but in one way or another, she was able to be brought to Long Island here in New York. And people in this chat organized to visit her and her mother and bring them food and bring them clothing, bring them things to read and coloring books and things to draw on, and coordinate picking them up, bringing them to doctor's appointments, bringing them back to where they were staying. And I wish I could remember the facility. I think it was a local location of the Ronald McDonald House. So when I think of these things, I think of how much support and how many networks and organizations there actually are. And I agree, discoverability can be a real problem in terms of finding and connecting to these organizations. And yes, I absolutely understand that a number of organizations want to be very careful and selective of who they let in at times like these. But what I'm leaving our episode today with is the notion that meeting each other's needs does not have to be complicated. We can start our own organizations to help with that, but oftentimes we don't need to. Oftentimes there are existing organizations. And even without those things, I believe one of the most important first steps is to just look around the world, the hyperlocal world we're in, with the question of how can I be of support today? And that's actually a practice I would like to build for myself as well. I try to take a walk every day for a half hour or an hour. I typically walk the same streets of the same neighborhoods. And I would like to bring that eye to what I see and remember that even tiny little things I can do, like saying hello or just acknowledging the existence of other people, it does make a difference. That it's not always about the big scale things.
Yeah, you're reminding me that today's the start of Lent, and I I saw in a like quite a liberation theology Substack post a call for people to, over Lent to do some intentional how to be of service to people every day, you know. And of course, I want everyone to do that all year, but it's just kind of an opportunity to think about doing it intentionally, and maybe it will become habit if we're not already doing that. But yeah, it's been lovely to have this not a coffee with you, Chris.
Thank you, Heather. I agree. Thank you as always. And I will be leaving with a better mindset than when I came in. So thank you for that
Nice.
as well.
Yeah, I appreciate this too, and I'll look for you next week to see if you have time for another chat.
I will see you then. Talk to you
Okay,
later.
bye.
Bye. You have been listening to Morning Tinto with Heather Luna and Chris Musay Sequeira. Each time we record, we use the news of the day to be as freshly brewed as possible. So subscribe, follow along, and comment if you can. Let us know what you think, and we will talk to you soon. Bye bye.